The Stanford Prison Experiment. When good people become monsters. Look at the person next to you, your friend, your colleague, your family member. Now imagine them, in just 6 days, psychologically torturing another human being. Not because they're evil, not because they're unstable, but because someone gave them permission. In August 1971, a psychology professor transformed the basement of Stanford University into a prison. He recruited normal, healthy college students, screened for psychological stability, and randomly assigned them roles: guard or prisoner. The experiment was designed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. What happened in that basement challenges everything we believe about human nature, morality, and the thin line between civilization and barbarism. This wasn't about bad apples. This was about discovering that under the right conditions, the barrel itself is poisonous. What if the evil we see in the world, in prisons, in war crimes, in acts of systematic cruelty, isn't about individual pathology? What if it's about situation? What if any of us, given the right circumstances, could become the monster? Today, we journey through evidence that challenges everything we think we know about good and evil, about human nature itself, and about the terrifying speed with which ordinary people can transform into instruments of psychological torture. Prepare yourselves. We begin. The year is 1971. America is convulsing. The Vietnam War rages. Reports of the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers slaughtered over 500 Vietnamese civilians, haunt the national consciousness. The question reverberates through universities, through dinner tables, through the collective American psyche. How do ordinary men commit atrocities? Dr. Philip Zimbardo, a 38-year-old psychology professor at Stanford University, believed he had a way to find out. The prevailing wisdom of the time blamed individual pathology. Bad people do bad things. Nazi guards were sadists. Prison guards who abuse inmates are predisposed to violence. The military attracts aggressive personalities. This explanation was comforting because it maintained a clear boundary: them and us, the good people and the bad people. But Zimbardo suspected something far more disturbing: that the situation itself, the role, the uniform, the institutional permission, could transform anyone. On August 14, 1971, Zimbardo placed an advertisement in the Palo Alto newspaper: male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks. 75 young men responded. Each underwent extensive psychological testing, personality assessments, clinical interviews, background checks. Zimbardo and his team were looking for the most average, most psychologically stable individuals they could find. They specifically excluded anyone with a history of crime, psychological issues, or drug abuse. From this pool, they selected 24 men. 24 college students who scored in the normal to average range on all psychological measures. No sadistic tendencies, no authoritarian personalities, no antisocial traits. By every measurable standard, these were good people. The basement of Stanford's Jordan Hall was transformed. Real prison cells were constructed. A closet became the hole, solitary confinement. Zimbardo consulted with former prisoners and correctional officers to ensure authenticity. Then came the random assignment. A literal coin flip determined fate: guard or prisoner. Nothing about personality, nothing about preference, nothing about predisposition. Pure chance decided who would wield power and who would be subjected to it. Think about that. The only thing separating the guards from the prisoners was random assignment. They were the same type of people, pulled from the same pool, equally psychologically healthy. On Sunday, August 15th, the experiment began, with a dramatic touch. Real Palo Alto police officers, cooperating with the study, performed surprise arrests at the participants' homes. The soon-to-be prisoners were charged with armed robbery, read the Miranda rights, handcuffed and transported in actual squad cars. At the prison, they were stripped, searched, deloused with a spray, and forced to stand naked in the yard. Each was given a number. No names, only numbers. They were issued smocks with their numbers, nylon stocking caps to simulate shaved heads, and a chain locked around one ankle. The guards received khaki uniforms, reflective sunglasses to prevent eye contact, and billy clubs. They were told only to maintain order. No physical violence was permitted. Beyond that, they were given almost complete autonomy. Zimbardo later said, "We wanted to see what happens when you put good people in an evil place." For the first day, things seemed almost playful. The prisoners tested boundaries with pranks. The guards were tentative, uncertain in their roles. Everyone seemed aware they were playing parts. But something was already changing beneath the surface. The guards began developing their own rules, their own procedures, their own power structures. By the end of day one, the foundation was set. The roles were taking hold. But this represents just one piece of the puzzle. What happened next would shock even Zimbardo himself. Act 2. The Descent. Day 2. Monday morning, 2:30 a.m. The prisoners are awakened by whistles shrieking through the basement. The guards force them from their cells for a count. This is ostensibly to ensure all prisoners are accounted for, a standard prison procedure. But the count lasts for hours. The prisoners stand at attention, exhausted, while guards shout their numbers. Prisoner 8612 makes a mistake. He recites his number incorrectly. The guards force him to do push-ups, then jumping jacks, then more push-ups. The other prisoners are forced to watch. This is when the psychological horror truly begins. By mid-morning, the prisoners attempted their first rebellion. They barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds. They ripped off their numbers. They shouted at the guards, taunting them. The guards' response was swift and revealing. They called in the night shift guards, off duty for reinforcement. They used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the doors. They stripped the prisoners naked. They took away their beds. And then came the most psychologically sophisticated form of control. They created a privilege cell. 3 prisoners who had barely participated in the rebellion were given back their beds, their uniforms, and allowed to wash. They were given special food while the others watched. After half a day, the guards mixed them back in with the general population. The psychological effect was devastating. The prisoners couldn't trust each other. Were the privileged prisoners informants? Had they made deals with the guards? Paranoia fractured any possibility of solidarity. Let me be clear about what's happening here. This is day 2, approximately 36 hours into the experiment. The guards weren't trained in these tactics. They weren't following a manual. They were inventing in real time the psychological techniques used in actual authoritarian prisons around the world. The privilege cell tactic? It's a documented strategy used by the Stasi in East Germany, by Soviet interrogators, by the North Korean prison system. These college students, with no background in corrections or interrogation, spontaneously recreated it. Prisoner 8612, Douglas Corpy, began to break.
He experienced what he later described as extreme emotional disturbance. He screamed, he raged, he cried uncontrollably. He told the guards he wanted out. The guards believed he was faking, trying to manipulate his way out of the experiment. They put him in the hole, a closet barely large enough to stand in, completely dark. When Zimbardo finally interviewed him, Corpi was in acute psychological distress. He was released after just 36 hours. One participant down. But something even more disturbing was happening. The prisoners who remained weren't relieved by his departure. They were anxious. If someone could break that quickly, what did that mean about Batham? By day 3, the guards had divided themselves into groups. Some remained relatively fair, following rules but not going beyond them. Others became what Zimbardo called good guards, passive, never abusing prisoners but never intervening when others did. And then there were approximately 1/3 of the guards who, in Zimbardo's words, became sadistic. These guards volunteered for extra shifts. They invented new forms of humiliation. They seemed to derive genuine pleasure from their power. One guard, who would later be dubbed John Wayne by the prisoners, became particularly creative in his cruelty. He forced prisoners to simulate sodomy. He made them clean toilet bowls with their bare hands. He conducted counts that lasted hours, requiring prisoners to recite their numbers in increasingly humiliating ways. Here's what makes this even more disturbing. John Wayne wasn't a sadist before the experiment. He was a quiet, unremarkable college student. He scored completely normally on all psychological assessments. There was nothing in his background that predicted this behavior. In later interviews, he explained that he was acting a role based on a character from the film Cool Hand Luke, playing a tough, Southern prison guard. But the prisoners weren't experiencing acting. They were experiencing real humiliation, real degradation, real psychological torture. The line between performance and reality had dissolved. By day 4, the prisoners had largely internalized their roles. They referred to themselves by number. They followed orders without question. When talking about the experiment, they didn't say, "leave the experiment." They said, "get parole," or "be released." They had begun thinking of themselves as actual prisoners. Prisoner 416, Clay Ramsey, described it later. The worst thing wasn't the humiliation, or the lack of privacy, or even the petty cruelty. The worst thing was realizing that I had stopped thinking of myself as Clay. I was 416, and being a prisoner was all that mattered. The experiment had consumed their identities. But this represents just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The question wasn't just what was happening to the prisoners. It was what was happening to everyone, including the experimenters themselves. Act 3. The Corruption of Everyone. Christina Maslach was a recent Stanford psychology PhD graduate. On the evening of day 5, she came to observe the experiment. She was also Zimbardo's girlfriend. She watched as the guards lined up prisoners, bags over their heads, chains rattling, and marched them to the bathroom. She saw the degradation, the humiliation, the casual cruelty. She became upset. She told Zimbardo the experiment had to stop. His response? He became angry at her. He said she was being too soft, too emotional, that she didn't understand the scientific value of what they were documenting. Out of approximately 50 people who had observed the experiment by that point, other psychologists, graduate students, former prisoners serving as consultants, Christina Maslach was the first and only person to object on moral grounds. Think about that. 50 people with direct observation of what was happening, multiple professional psychologists, and only one said, "This is wrong. This must stop." This is the terrifying expansion of the experiment's lesson. It wasn't just about guards and prisoners. It was about how an entire system, everyone with knowledge, everyone with power to intervene, becomes complicit. Zimbardo himself had stopped being a researcher. He had become the prison superintendent. He conducted parole hearings. He worried about escapes. He was concerned with maintaining the integrity of his prison, not the well-being of his participants. On day 5, the parents of one prisoner came to visit. Their son had lost weight. He looked haggard, defeated. They could have demanded his release. They could have simply taken him home. Instead, they treated it like a real prison visit. They asked if he was being fed enough. They worried about his record. They operated entirely within the fiction of the prison. The experiment had swallowed them too. But perhaps the most chilling moment came with prisoner 819. Stuart, prisoner 819, was breaking. He was sobbing, experiencing what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. Zimbardo took him to a restroom to calm down. He told Stuart he could leave. The experiment was over for him. Stuart heard the other prisoners in the yard. The guards were making them chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner. Because of what prisoner 819 did, my cell is a mess. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing." Stuart began crying harder. He said, "I can't leave. I have to go back and show them I'm not a bad prisoner." Zimbardo had to physically shake him and repeat, "You're not 819, you're Stuart. This is just an experiment. You can leave." The psychological reality had become more powerful than actual reality. Stuart wasn't being held against his will. No one was forcing him to stay. He could walk out the door at any moment. But the prison in his mind was more real than the freedom available to him. This is the mechanism of psychological horror, not physical coercion, not explicit violence, but the construction of a psychological cage so complete that the prisoner can't perceive the unlocked door. On the evening of day 5, after Christina Maslach's objection, Zimbardo finally saw what he had created. He called off the experiment. 6 days. The 2-week experiment lasted 6 days. When he told the guards, some were disappointed. When he told the prisoners, they were relieved, but also confused. Many asked about charges being dropped. Some worried about what would go on their record. Even after being told it was over, the psychological prison lingered. But this represents just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Because the controversy around the Stanford prison experiment didn't end in 1971. It's continued for over 50 years, and what we've learned since then makes the horror even more complex.
Act 4. The Controversy and the Deeper Truth. For decades, the Stanford prison experiment was treated as settled science. It appeared in every psychology textbook. It was cited in legal cases about prison reform. It became the definitive demonstration that situation, not character, determines behavior. But in the 2000s, researchers began examining the original tapes, the archived materials, the full documentation. What they found was disturbing in a completely different way. French researcher Thibault Letexier spent years in Stanford's archives. He discovered that Zimbardo's published accounts omitted crucial details. The guards hadn't spontaneously developed their cruel tactics. Zimbardo had explicitly instructed them to create feelings of boredom, fear, and arbitrary control. Some guards later admitted they felt they were supposed to be harsh, that the experiment demanded it. They were performing cruelty because they believed that's what the study required. The prisoners, too, weren't simply reacting authentically. Many later said they were playing along, trying to help the experiment succeed, performing what they thought prisoners would do. So does this mean the Stanford prison experiment was a fraud? That the lessons we drew from it were false? No. The truth is more nuanced and, in many ways, more disturbing. Because here's what the controversy reveals. Even if the guards were performing cruelty, even if some were faking their transformations, even if Zimbardo influenced the results, the psychological effects were real. The trauma was real. The speed at which people adopted roles, even performatively, was real. And the real-world parallels are undeniable. Abu Ghraib Prison, Iraq, 2003. American soldiers with no training in interrogation or detention tortured Iraqi prisoners. They forced them into naked pyramids. They attached electrodes. They used dogs to terrorize them. They photographed their humiliation. These weren't sadists. They were regular soldiers, including a woman named Lindy England, who had been described by those who knew her as the girl next door. They were placed in a chaotic situation with minimal oversight, given implicit permission to soften up detainees, and told they were serving a greater good. The parallels to Stanford are impossible to ignore. Or consider the Milgram obedience experiments, conducted a decade before Stanford. Ordinary people administered what they believed were lethal electric shocks to strangers simply because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to continue. Or the horrifying reality of police brutality, where officers who score normally on psychological evaluations nonetheless engage in systematic abuse. Or the mechanics of genocide, where ordinary citizens become participants in mass murder. The lesson isn't that humans are inherently evil. The lesson is that moral behavior is fragile, that under the right conditions, ambiguous authority, dehumanization of others, diffusion of responsibility, gradual escalation, almost anyone can participate in cruelty. This forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature, about morality, about the distance between us and the monsters we condemn. Act 5. The implications. The most profound implications emerge when we consider what the Stanford prison experiment, flawed, controversial, ethically problematic, reveals about the architecture of evil. Evil doesn't require evil people. It requires ordinary people in systems that permit, encourage, or simply fail to prevent harmful behavior. Consider your own life, your workplace, your social groups, your institutions. When have you witnessed someone being treated cruelly and said nothing? When have you participated in gossip, in exclusion, in small cruelties because the group dynamic permitted it? When have you adopted a role, the demanding boss, the strict parent, the aggressive competitor, and felt yourself transforming, felt permission to act in ways you normally wouldn't? The Stanford prison experiment isn't about guards and prisoners in 1971. It's about all of us, every day, in every situation where power dynamics exist. But here's the crucial point that often gets lost. Awareness is prevention. The guards who remained fair didn't lack the same situational pressures. They made different choices. Christina Maslach, in the same situation as 50 other observers, spoke up. Prisoner 416, even while internalizing his role, maintained a sense of self separate from his number. Knowing that situations can corrupt us is the first step in resisting that corruption. Understanding that roles can consume identity helps us maintain boundaries. Recognizing that authority can demand cruelty helps us question orders. The horror of the Stanford prison experiment isn't that humans are monsters. It's that we contain the capacity for both cruelty and compassion, and the situation determines which emerges. The hope is that understanding this, we can build better situations. Conclusion. We began with a question: could a good person become a monster? After this journey through the evidence, through 6 days in a basement at Stanford, through the controversy and revelations, through the real-world parallels, we have our answer. Yes. And that yes should terrify us. But it should also motivate us. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the most controversial studies in psychology's history. Some argue it should be struck from textbooks, dismissed as methodologically flawed and ethically bankrupt. Others maintain it revealed essential truths about human behavior. Perhaps both are right. What's undeniable is this: in 6 days, college students transformed. Some became sadistic. Some became broken. Some became passive observers of abuse. And one person, just one, said stop. The question isn't whether the Stanford Prison Experiment was perfect science. The question is what we do with its lessons. We live in a world filled with situations, prisons, police departments, military units, corporations, social media platforms, where power dynamics create the conditions for abuse, where roles can override individual morality, where systems corrupt good people. The horror isn't that this happened in 1971 in a basement at Stanford. The horror is that it's still happening, everywhere, in ways large and small. But we end not with despair, but with agency. Because if situations shape behavior, we can change situations. If roles transform people, we can design better roles. If systems enable cruelty, we can build systems that enable compassion. The thin line between good and evil isn't fixed. It's not about who we are. It's about the choices we make, the situations we create, and the courage to say, when everyone else is silent, this is wrong, this must stop. That's the true lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment. And that lesson, flawed origin and all, might be the most important one we ever learn.